Now that we had a look at a couple of components and useful TypeScript patterns for working with those components, I want to come back to this input component here, and I want to turn it into a component to which we can forward refs. Which simply means that I want to be able to, for example, set the ref prop here, the special ref prop that's supported by React, to set it on this input element from outside this component. For example, from inside the app component, if I'm using the input component there. Now, this does not work by simply adding ref as a prop to our props object type here. This will not work. It will also not work by switching from component props without ref to component props with ref. If I do that, there indeed is a ref prop I can extract, and I can bind it to this input here, but if I go to the app component then, and there I import input from components, input tsx, and output it here, if I do that, set a label like test and an ID like test. If I do all that, I can set the ref prop here, but I'll not get the expected behavior. If I quickly create a ref here with useRef, as you learned it in the previous course section, my input ref here, and I use that as a value, and I then add null here as an initial value, and I save everything. If I preview the app thereafter, I get an error here. I get an error which basically tells me that I can't pass a ref to a custom component like this, that I instead need to use React's forward ref function. And that's therefore exactly what we'll do in this section. So I'll keep this code here in the app component, but I'll revisit the input component. And here indeed the solution is not to use component props with ref. Instead we can go back to the without ref version, and we don't want to extract the ref like this. That won't work, as you saw. Instead, what we have to do here, and what we would have to do in a vanilla JavaScript React application as well, is that we wrap this component function here with the forward ref function that is provided by React. And that's now not some type or anything like that. Instead, that's a real function which we can call. And here I am calling it, and you should pass your component function as a value to forward ref then. Now here it's then a good idea to actually store it in a standalone constant, which is then exported like this. And with that we got the base set up, but we're not done. Instead, when you do wrap a component function with forward ref, it no longer receives just the props. Instead, now it will also receive a ref parameter. So it receives the props parameter with this type and a ref parameter. And that's now the ref that can be forwarded to that input ref, which is used internally here. And that's the ref which we set from inside the app component by targeting this ref prop. But we're not there yet. Instead, I'm getting an error here, pretty long error, but in the end we got some compatibility issues as it seems. And the core problem is that this ref parameter which we're getting is a forwarded ref, but it is referring to some unknown value. So we got a generic type here because this ref object in React in the end is just a wrapper around some value that we're managing. And here, of course, TypeScript doesn't know which value will eventually be received on that ref object. And it therefore doesn't know if it is a value that can be connected to this input element, if it's an HTML input element type, so to say. That's why forward ref, which is coming from React, is a generic function. where you don't have to, but typically should provide extra type information. Extra type information about some related type. And here, the related type is the type of value that will eventually be stored in that ref. And in this case, that will be an HTML input element because that's how I plan on using this ref. Therefore, the type we pass between those angle brackets is the built-in HTML input element type. Now, that's not enough though. Forward ref is a generic function and it actually wants two generic types. Now, we actually didn't have to specify any type. It tried to infer those types instead. But if you do explicitly specify one type, you also have to specify the second type. And the second type simply refers to the type of props this wrapped function will receive. The first type refers to the value the ref will manage. The second generic type you pass to forward ref will refer to the type of props the wrapped function will receive. So in this case, input props. Therefore, you can actually get rid of this type annotation here, because instead, internally, it's now this type that will be assumed for the props, thanks to forward ref and how it works internally. And therefore, as you can see, we got rid of all the errors, and this now works, because now TypeScript understands that the ref we're getting here is meant to be connected to this input element. Therefore, in the app component, we also should provide this extra generic type here to make it very clear that the ref we're managing here will eventually be connected to an HTML input element and will store such an element object in the future. And with that, if we save that and go back and reload, you will see that there is no more error in the developer tools, because that's how we forward refs and how we work with refs correctly when dealing with custom components. And that's how we type them when working with TypeScript and React. Okay, so we really spent a lot of time on components now, but this is the part where you'll typically use TypeScript the most, where you got the most typing work to do. Now for this section, we're almost done though. But there is another component I want to add together with you. A form component, which in the end should work as a wrapper around form input fields and which should contain the logic for handling the form submission. So a wrapper component that's built as a wrapper component to handle some logic which we might want to use in different places of the app. For that, of course, as always, we should export the component function, the form component function here. And then inside of that component function, it's the built-in form element that should be rendered, that should be returned, therefore. Now, since my plan here is to build this as a wrapper component, and that's what I'm doing here, I want to make sure that I accept all the standard props that could be set on form. And of course, by now you did already learn how that can be achieved. We can add our own form props type here, and in the end just set that equal to component props without ref here, and connect that to the built-in form element like this, so to say. So that form props here is essentially an alias for this type here, which gives me an object type which contains all the props that are accepted by the form element. So therefore here we get our props, the form props, and we can simply forward them to the form like this. We can also output the children, the form tags like that if we want to. Now with that, we got a wrapper component, and we're not finished yet, but we got a starting point, and we can use that in the app component, for example. There, we could now use this form component by importing it and wrap it around a couple of input components. So our own input component being used here. And I'll get rid of that ref here because I don't need it right now. So here we could have an input of type text where I want to get the name of the user, and the ID could be name here, therefore. And I can have a second input here, maybe of type number with a label of age and an ID of age, let's say. And then below that, we can have a paragraph which contains a button, our own custom button, which we built. Here being used as a button where we say save, for example. If we do all that, it's this form that we see on the screen. And indeed, if I click save, this form was submitted. Though at the moment, of course, nothing happens. But that's now exactly what I want to handle inside of this form wrapper component. Because that's the idea behind this wrapper component. It's there to contain some logic that should be enclosed in this component. It should handle the form submission. So how can we handle the form submission here? Well, just as you learned it earlier in the course. We can add a nested function here that could be called handle submit. The name, of course, is up to you. And as you learned, that function, if we connect it to the form through the onSubmit prop, will receive an event automatically passed in by React. And that event will be of type form event, which is another type that can and should be imported from React. And form event, as you also learned earlier in the course already, is a generic type where we can specify which exact element triggered that event. And here it will be a HTML form element, this built-in type, because I'm going to connect this handle submit function to the onSubmit function here. With that inside of handle submit, we can now call event prevent default to make sure that this default browser behavior, where the page is submitted and an HTTP request is being sent, is prevented. And we can then add the logic for extracting the entered data. Because that's what I want to do in this form component here. I don't just want to prevent the default, though that could also be a reason for building such a wrapper, so that we don't have to repeat that code over and over again. But here I actually want to do more than that. I want to get the submitted data by creating a new form data object, and that's a built-in class built into JavaScript, and passing event current target to it. This is a mechanism, you could say, that's built into the browser, built into JavaScript, that allows us to automatically gather all the values that have been entered into any input field inside of the form and group them together in such a data object. For this mechanism to work, we just have to do one important thing. All the inputs that should be included and that should be considered must receive a name. So the name prop must be set. And we could do this manually here, or we go to the input component and take advantage of the fact that we have this reusable component, and we simply add the name prop here to make sure that we'll always have that being set. And we can simply set it to the ID, I guess, because that ID will be unique for every input here. With that back in the form, we'll have a name on every input that's passed to this form, and we therefore will get our data. Now, this data object that we get here will be of type form data, and that can be a bit of a clunky object. For example, we won't be able to access the data that's stored in the name field with data.name. Instead, we have to call the get method and then look for the input with the name like this. Thankfully, we can simplify this though by creating a new constant, and I'll name this one form data and this one just data, where we use the built-in object class and call the static fromEntries method on it. And we can pass form data to it, and this will essentially convert this form data object to a simpler object where we can then access data with data.name and so on. So that will then be a data object that contains the collected input data. But now, of course, that data must be passed from the form component to the component that's using the form, because that's the component that will need to work with that data. And we can achieve this by merging these standard form props with a custom props object to add more props to this custom form component. Specifically here, I want to add an onSave prop, which should be a function value, so where the type is a function type, where I want to get some submitted value, and I'll get back to the type in just a second, and which shouldn't return anything. Now the value type is a bit tricky though, because of course this form here can be wrapped around any inputs. So inside of the form component, we don't really know what kind of data will be collected here and which kind of inputs we had between those form tags. So we don't know in advance which exact shape data here will have. That's why a good type to use here is the built-in unknown type, which simply means what it sounds like, that we don't know in advance what the value here will be. This allows us to use props onSave here and pass data to it. Now we'll then have to make sure to appropriately handle that data in the place where we use the form in the future, but for this component, that's all we have to do. This now allows us to go to the app component, and there we can add a new function, handleSave, where we'll get some data, which has the type unknown, as we just discussed, because it's this handleSave function which I want to set as a value for onSave. Now inside of handleSave, we now have to deal with the fact that we don't know what that data will be. But we only don't know what the data will be inside of the form component. We do know the shape of the data here in the app component because that's where we have those inputs and where we have the names that we in the end assign to those inputs. Therefore, here we'll have our extracted data, if you want to call it like this, which is that data, but now I want to convince TypeScript that I know what the type of that data is. And that can be done with help of the built-in as keyword. This allows us to convert the type TypeScript knows to a different type, if we know better than TypeScript what a type is. And I do know it better here. Because the type here will be an object, because fromEntries will generate an object, and in that object, the names that are assigned to the inputs, so in the end here the IDs, because we set the ID also as a name value in the input component, those names will be the properties, the key names in that object, and the values will be the values entered by the user. So here I'll have my name, which will be a string, and I'll have my age, which should also be a string, because values entered into input fields are always of type string when we extract them. Even if the input field had type number, that's just affecting how it will be presented. It's not affecting how the value is extracted. That will always be a string. And we can then, of course, for example, log that extracted data. And with that, we built this form wrapper, and we're now using it. And therefore, if we go back here and I open my developer tools, I'm getting a warning here, to which we'll get back in a second, but I'm actually able to enter values here. And if I click Save, I see that here in the console. So extracting those values did work with help of that wrapper. Now, what's this error or this warning here about? Well, it's in the end telling me that I'm using onSave somewhere where it's unknown or unexpected, you could say. And that would be in the form component, the built-in form element. Keep in mind that I'm forwarding all props to form here. And that of course includes my custom props here, so the onSave prop. So the onSave prop is also set on that form, but of course the form doesn't know what to do with onSave. It's not a standard prop that would exist on that element. The solution to this problem is to simply use object destructuring here and to pull out onSave and children and then group the other props into a new object. And then here we call just onSave in handle submit. We use just children down there and we spread other props onto the form here. With that, if we save this, you'll see that if you now open the DevTools and you reload, the error is gone. And that's how we can build such a form wrapper component, which, unlike the other components, is not really about shared JSX or styling, but instead about shared logic. So now that we have this form component, I want to enhance it. I want to add an extra feature to it. I want to expose a function on my own custom component that can be called from outside that component to interact with that component. And to give you an example for what I mean, I'll start by adding a ref here inside of this form component. A ref which I want to connect to my form here. So we can use the built-in ref prop and set it equal to form, set this to null initially, and make it clear that we'll connect it to a HTML form element by adding the appropriate type. That's what we did before in this course as well. Now we could use this form ref, for example, after calling onSave, to call the built-in reset method, which exists on this HTML form element, so on the underlying form object to which we got access by connecting it with that ref prop. This will reset the form. So if I save that and I enter some values here, if I click save, you see that the form is reset thereafter. Now reset is therefore a method that exists on the underlying form object of that native form element. Now I want to expose a similar method from my form component so that, for example, in the app component, I can connect my form to a ref and then call form clear, let's say here, form.currentClear, if form would be connected to my form and my form would expose a clear method, which then maybe also resets the form. So what we need to do here is expose an API in that component here. And in React, this can be done by using the built-in useImperative handle hook. A pretty strange name and honestly not a hook you'll use all the time, but a hook that is extremely important if you want to expose some callable functions from your component to another place in the app. For example, to offer such a clear method. So this hook must be imported, and I'm doing that here. And with that hook imported, it now must be configured. It must be called correctly. And indeed, this hook basically only works in a component that also receives a forwarded ref. So therefore, I'll add forward ref here and wrap my form component function with it, store it in a constant called form, and then export that as a default. And of course, forward ref also must be imported. And we now have to change this component function because, as you learned before, it now does not just receive a props parameter, but instead a second ref parameter. And we need that ref parameter because useImperativeHandle needs such a ref value as a first argument. As a second argument, it needs a function that should return an object. And this object can then contain any methods you want to be able to call on this component from outside that component. For example, a clear method, added like this. Here in this clear method, in this form component still, I could then, for example, use this form ref, which you should not confuse with the incoming ref. Instead, form here is a ref I'm creating with useRef inside of the form component. And that's the ref that's connected to the native form element. And I could use that in clear, therefore, to call form current reset, so that my custom form component essentially exposes a custom clear method, which under the hood simply calls the built-in reset method. Now here I'm getting an error because form current could possibly be null. After all, it is null initially, but we can simply add a question mark here so that reset is only executed if this is not null. Otherwise, nothing happens. We can also console log clearing here to make it obvious that this function was executed. So that's how we can expose such a clear method, and that's just standard JavaScript. In the app component, we now need to create a ref which we connect to our custom component. So here we should also call useRef and have our custom form ref, for example, which initially also is null, and set this as a value for the ref prop on our own custom component. Now we can call custom_form.current.clear here. Now current could be null, so I also want to add a question mark here. But I'm now also getting another error, because it's not clear to TypeScript that this custom form ref will be connected to an object that has a clear method. Indeed, custom form is initially null and then some ref referring to some value. We should give TypeScript more information about this ref and the value that will be handled with that ref. And for that, we should go back to the form component, where we also use imperative_handle, where we use this hook. There, you should add a new type. And you should actually export that type, because we'll also need to access it in another file soon, in the app component file, to be precise. I'll name this type formHandle, but of course the name is up to you. But in the end, this type here should describe this object which is returned by useImperativeHandle. Because that's what this ref, this forwarded ref, will be referring to. So in the app component, this custom form ref, when we connect it to form, will not refer to our custom component as a whole. Instead, it will refer to this object here. And therefore, I'm exporting this formHandle type here, where I add the signature of this clear method. So the name is clear, and then it is a function that receives no parameters and that doesn't return anything. And of course, you could have a function that does receive something and that does return a value. But here, it's really just a function that takes no input and returns nothing. Now that's therefore the value of this ref, because as I mentioned, that is what this forwarded ref will be referring to. And therefore, just as we did it before in this course, we should take advantage of the generic nature of forward ref and set the first generic type here, which is the type that describes the type of the ref that's forwarded. And as a second type, as mentioned before, set the type of the props object, so form props here. Hence, we can remove this type annotation here. So with that, we enhanced this form component in the app component, we should now import this form handle type, and we can therefore annotate it as such and make it clear that this is a type from the form component file, and then set this as a generic type on this useRef hook here to make it clear that the ref will be managing with custom form will eventually refer to this form handle object. And with that, that error on clear here went away. If we now save that all and we revisit this app, we're not getting any error here. And if I submit this, you'll see that as I click save, this is reset and clearing is being output here. And clearing is being output because this clear method was called, because that's where we have this log. And that's also where we reset the form, because I'm not doing that in handle submit anymore. So that works, and that's how you can expose an API, callable methods from your component to other components in your app. As mentioned, typically not something you'll do all the time, but something you'll need to do from time to time, and that's why I also covered it here.